This man was feared in silence. Harlan West, the ruthless billionaire cloaked in mystery. No one dared question his rule. No one even whispered his name without glancing over their shoulder. Yet here he stood disguised as a mere manager, eyes cold movements, deliberate hunting for flaws that did not exist. Elena knelt with her rag pressed to the floor, her back bent, her breath shallow. Every inch of marble already gleamed, yet her hands kept moving, desperate to erase what could not be erased. Beyond the doorway, David watched his knuckles pale as he clenched his fists, helpless and burning inside. The man halted, his shoes striking the stillness like gunshots. His gaze froze on the spotless glass table. With a single gesture sharp as a verdict, he ordered, "Dirty." Again. What none of them knew, this man was Harlan West himself. She moved like a shadow no one noticed. A mop in her hand, she bent low to trace every narrow line of the marble floor, her motions careful, almost invisible. Her uniform, once crisp, had faded to a dull gray seams stretched from years of wear. It clung to her frame as if it carried the weight of her exhaustion. Her eyes rarely lifted. When footsteps echoed near, she turned her face away, afraid to be caught in a stare. To survive, she had mastered the art of vanishing in plain sight. When her name was called, her body instinctively bowed, shoulders folding inward, her voice nothing more than a whisper. Around her, colleagues sighed with quiet pity. "She's too gentle," one murmured, shaking a head. "She endures everything." The words trailed in the air, unnoticed by her but heavy for anyone listening. Each sweep of her mop erased dirt but deepened the silence that surrounded her. Elena existed in the cracks of this grand palace, a presence half seen, half forgotten. And yet, in her silence, something lingered, a fragile dignity, hidden but unbroken. David carried an old backpack slung over his shoulder, its straps frayed, its weight heavier than the tools inside. Each step he took landed with the heaviness of a man whose world had been stripped away. His boots scuffed against the pavement, the sound dull, defeated. Once he had stood proud inside the factory halls of West Industries. Machines roared, sparks lit the air, and his hands worked with steady skill. He believed his place was secure, until the loudspeaker crackled one morning, delivering words that shattered hundreds of lives, layoffs, effective immediately. The crowd pushed toward the gates. He remembered the guard's cold eyes as he shoved him out. Dust clung to his clothes, his palms hung empty, and his breath caught in his throat. The door slammed behind him, shutting out not just his job, but a piece of his dignity. Since then, David walked with the look of a man haunted. His eyes carried both the fatigue of endless odd jobs and the silent rage of betrayal. Beneath his silence was a storm, the humiliation of being discarded like scrap metal and the fear of never rising again. The kitchen was cramped, its single light bulb flickering above a peeling table. The glow was weak, casting more shadows than warmth. On that table lay stacks of bills folded and creased from being counted too many times. Elena sat, hunched, her fingers trembling as she spread the notes, wrinkled ones, a handful of coins. She counted, stopped, then counted again, her lips moving silently. The number never changed, and it was never enough. Across from her, David leaned forward, his elbows pressed hard against the table. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the bills as though sheer will might multiply them. Neither spoke for a long time, the only sound the rustle of paper and the distant drip of a leaking faucet. Finally, Elena broke the silence. Her voice was tired but urgent. "We can't lose this job. If we do, there's nothing left." David's hand reached across the table, covering hers. His grip was firm, steady, carrying the weight of everything he couldn't say aloud. He didn't promise because promises cost too much, but in his eyes a flame still burned, fierce and unyielding. That night in that dim kitchen, their poverty filled the air like smoke, suffocating, inescapable. Yet between their hands lay the only thing holding them upright, the determination not to be broken. The doors opened, and a man in a flawless suit stepped inside. His tie was fixed with military precision, shoes polished to a mirror's gleam. But it was not the clothes that silenced the room, it was his eyes. They swept across the staff one by one, sharp and unyielding like a searchlight, exposing every hidden flaw. No one dared breathe too loudly under that gaze. He spoke only once, his voice flat, cold, cutting through the stillness. "If you fail, you leave. Nothing more, nothing less." The words dropped like a hammer. Heads lowered at once. Not a single pair of eyes met his. Even the air seemed to thin, pressing down on the workers until their spines curved. In the corner, Elena clutched the handle of her mop tighter, her knuckles pale, her breath unsteady. She forced herself to inhale, steadying her trembling chest. She had survived worse, she told herself, but in her heart a chill spread. One misstep and everything she and David clung to could vanish. The man turned away as if dismissing them all at once, yet the echo of his warning lingered heavy, unforgiving. Whispers filled the hallways as though the walls themselves carried them. "He's ruthless," one voice said. 3 people gone in a single week. Another voice joined, "Doesn't blink. Doesn't listen. One mistake, and you're finished." The rumors tangled like threads weaving a net of fear no one could escape. Elena caught fragments as she pushed her cart past. Her shoulders shrank inward, her chin pressed down. If it was true, her job was a thread dangling over a knife's edge. She bowed her head lower as if the act of making herself smaller might shield her. Later, David arrived to meet her. He caught the tail end of the murmurs, saw how workers avoided the manager's gaze, how even silence trembled under his presence. His brow furrowed unease, gnawing at him. He had faced men like this before, men who treated dignity as disposable. The new manager walked past his steps, measured his face, unreadable. He didn't acknowledge a single person. Not a nod, not a glance. He passed them as though they were furniture. The whispers died the moment he entered. Fear returned to silence. But silence can be heavier than words, and that silence settled inside David like a warning. This man would not stop until he broke someone. That evening, the contrasts revealed themselves like a cruel design. Harlan stepped into a golden elevator, its doors closing around him with polished perfection. The glow of brass reflected his form, sealing him in a chamber that carried him upward, smooth and effortless. At the same time, Elena began her descent. The stairwell was narrow, its paint peeling its air thick with dust. She clutched the railing with tired fingers, her steps slow, cautious as though each step drained what little strength remained. Outside, David stood waiting. Rain fell steadily, soaking his jacket, flattening his hair, sliding down his jaw. His boots sank into puddles, but he didn't move, didn't flinch. He only looked up at the building towering above him. From high above, through tinted glass, Harlan looked down. His gaze swept the city without recognition, detached, sovereign. Elena, emerging below, lifted her head. For a brief moment, their eyes traced the same invisible line from his place of power to her place of survival. A diagonal divide stretched between them, one man rising untouched, one woman descending burdened by gravity and fatigue. And waiting in the rain, David caught between 2 worlds, watching the line grow sharper every day. The smell of sawdust always carried him back. In his mind, the workshop opened again, golden light streaming through the slats of an old wooden door. His father, Walter Brooks, stood steady at the bench, hammer in hand, shaping oak into something lasting. David, small and wide-eyed, sat on a crate watching every movement. Walter's voice was firm, unshaken, echoing over the scrape of wood. There are times to be silent and times to stand. A true man knows the difference. Each word lodged deep as if carved into David's bones. He remembered how his father's hands, scarred and strong, never trembled even when the world pressed hard against them. To Walter, dignity was worth more than wages, more than comfort, more than fear. Now, years later, that same voice rang inside David's chest. He clenched his fists, felt the calluses still left from his own work, and knew the lesson had never left him. Though poverty had stripped much away, though humiliation had followed him home, the echo of his father's words stood firm. And in the quiet moments when Elena bent under commands she did not deserve, that voice returned louder, urging, "Stand, son. Stand when it matters." In the dim kitchen, the weak bulb hummed above them, spilling its tired light over unpaid bills. Elena reached across the table, her fingers gripping David's sleeve. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, yet sharp with fear. "Promise me. Don't interfere. I just want to keep this job." David forced a smile, but it faltered before it reached his eyes. He nodded a shallow gesture that fooled neither of them. In his gaze burned something restless, something that could not be caged. She saw it, the same stubbornness that had once gotten him into trouble, the same fire that frightened her now. Her shoulders sagged a sigh, escaping as if hope itself slipped out with her breath. David turned away, his hand curling into a fist at his side. The silence between them thickened, heavy with all the words unsaid. Elena stared at his back, her heart sinking. She knew him too well. He would try to honor her plea. He would bite his tongue until it bled. But when the moment came, when injustice cut too deep, she feared the fire inside him would break free, and when it did, everything they had clung to might collapse. In his private room, far from the whispers of the staff, the man adjusted his tie with meticulous care. Each fold sat in perfect alignment, each hair combed into place. He leaned closer to the mirror, studying himself not as others saw him, but as he chose to be seen. His reflection stared back sharp cheekbones, eyes like shards of glass, mouth set in a line of authority. He tilted his chin slightly, testing the angle of intimidation. For a moment his lips curved upward, not with warmth, but with the cold amusement of a predator satisfied with its disguise. To the workers outside he was only the new manager, cold, precise, unrelenting. But in the mirror he recognized the truth. He was Harlan West, billionaire ruler of towers that touched the clouds, cloaked now in ordinary clothes to hunt among his own. The irony almost made him laugh. To be unseen was a novelty, to be underestimated a game. And as he smoothed the lapel of his jacket, the thought sharpened his smile. They believed they were dealing with a manager. But soon they would learn whose shadow they had truly entered. The glass table gleamed under the overhead lights, spotless to any eye. Elena leaned in cloth, moving in slow, careful circles. She paused to examine her work, certain it was enough. Then came the sound of measured steps behind her. Harlan stopped. His shadow fell across the table, darkening her reflection. He bent slightly, eyes narrowing as though searching for something invisible. His voice cut through the silence. Dirty. Again. Elena's heart skipped. She pressed harder, wiping in tight strokes until her wrist ached. The surface shone brighter, catching every light. Still dirty. His words landed like stones. Her hands trembled as she wiped a third time, each motion more desperate than the last. Sweat beaded at her hairline, falling to the rag she clutched. She knew there was nothing left to clean, but the demand hung over her like a sentence. From the hallway, David's eyes fixed on her. His teeth pressed into his lip until he tasted blood, his fists curling at his sides. He wanted to storm in to tell the man off, but he stood rooted, trapped by his wife's silent plea for restraint. The table gleamed like a mirror, yet the accusation lingered. For Elena, it wasn't the table that was dirty, it was the power pressing her lower with every word. A stack of papers slipped from a clerk's hands, scattering across the polished floor. Sheets fluttered edges, soaking in spilled water from a nearby vase. The clerk's face flushed as he scrambled, but before he could stoop, Harlan's voice rang out. "You, pick them up." His finger aimed not at the clerk, but at Elena. She froze, cloth still in hand. "Sir, I." The protest died before it formed. His gaze left no room for argument. Elena bent slowly, her knees brushing the wet floor. She gathered the papers one by one, the ink bleeding into stains. Her fingers smudged with damp, leaving faint marks she could not erase. The clerk avoided her eyes, guilt pressing his shoulders down, but he said nothing. Around them, the staff moved faster, as though speed could shield them from notice. David, watching from the shadows of the corridor, felt heat rise in his chest. His breath grew ragged, and a sound escaped him, half growl, half sigh. He turned sharply, forcing himself to walk away before the fury inside him erupted. Each sheet she stacked was another injustice folded into silence, and each silence deepened the ache that David carried, the ache of a man forced to watch his wife punished for sins she had not committed. The porcelain cup tipped with casual grace, spilling its contents in a dark stream. Coffee spread quickly across the pale carpet, staining it like a wound. The sound was soft, almost deliberate. Elena rushed forward, knees hitting the floor. She pressed her cloth against the spreading stain, blotting, scrubbing, pressing harder as if urgency alone could undo the damage. Her tears fell freely now, mixing with the brown liquid, making the fabric in her hands heavier with every stroke. No one helped. A group of workers nearby turned their heads away, their eyes fixed on invisible tasks. To watch was unbearable, to intervene unthinkable. Silence became their shield. Harlan stood with arms folded, expression carved from stone. He didn't speak, didn't move, simply watched her crawl on the ground. To him, the scene was proof of control. One command, one gesture, and dignity collapsed. David's chest burned as he looked on. His nails dug into his palms until the skin threatened to break. Every instinct screamed at him to act, yet Elena's bowed head reminded him of the cost. To step forward would be to lose everything. The stain darkened, but what lingered most was not on the carpet. It was the sight of Elena on her knees, washing away a mess not her own, her pride sacrificed drop by drop while the man who caused it stood in satisfaction. The corridor hummed with uneasy silence, broken only by a voice barely above a breath. A young worker leaned close to David, eyes darting around before speaking. "He's worse than the CEO himself." The words struck hard, as if naming aloud what everyone feared but dared not say. David froze, his body stiff, the echo pounding in his head. He turned his gaze toward Elena across the hall. She was bent over, scrubbing without pause, her shoulders trembling from exhaustion. His heartbeat quickened, the sound of it heavy in his ears. Every muscle urged him forward, demanded he confront the man who reduced her to this. But his feet rooted to the ground, chained by her earlier plea. To move now would be to break the fragile line between survival and ruin. Then Harlan passed by his steps, crisp, his glance sharp as a blade. His eyes cut across the corridor, narrowing for a moment on David before flicking away with calculated dismissal. The whisper lingered in David's mind, a seed of fury taking root. He clenched his jaw, swallowing down the fire. For now, silence remained, but beneath it, something dangerous grew. The shift ended, but the weight of the day clung to Elena's frame. She stepped into the night's shoulders, hunched her thin body, shivering as rain swept across the street. The drops plastered her hair to her cheeks, mixing with the salt of quiet tears she didn't want seen. David moved forward, pulling his coat wide to shelter her. He drew her into his chest, his warmth against her cold. She sagged into him, her head pressing against his heartbeat. Her voice trembled against his shirt. "Don't interfere. Please." He lowered his chin, holding her closer, but his eyes lifted toward the tower looming above them. Lights glowed in every window, an empire of glass and wealth stretching high into the storm. His gaze hardened, unblinking steel, forged in silence. The rain blurred his vision, but not the fire inside. Rage pressed against his ribs, swelling with every drop that struck his skin. Elena clung to him, believing she had secured his promise. But he knew better. What lived inside him was not resignation, it was waiting. And each cruel moment in that tower only fed it more. The piano gleamed under soft light, its black frame pristine, its ivory keys untouched. Harlan's voice carried across the room, calm yet cutting clean each key. Every side. "I expect them spotless." Elena stiffened. Her body bent forward, hands trembling as she lowered the cloth. She began with the first note polishing carefully, then the next, her movements deliberate but unsteady. Sweat slid down her temple, dripping onto the white surface, leaving faint shadows before she wiped them away. From a distance, Harlan lounged in a chair, lips curled into a half-smile. To him, it was not about dust, but obedience, the pleasure of watching exhaustion turn into surrender. David inched forward, each step heavier than the last. His eyes locked on his wife, on the strain in her shoulders, the falter in her breath. His body ached to intervene, to shield her from the cruelty disguised as order. But Elena looked up just as he reached the edge of the room. Her eyes, wide and wet, pleaded silently. She shook her head, once her lips shaping words without sound. "Don't." The cloth squeaked softly against the keys as she returned to work. David stopped, fists clenched, his chest rising with rage he could not release. The music in the room was not from the piano. It was the rhythm of a woman breaking slowly and a man being forced to watch. By the time Elena reached the 40th key, her hands trembled so badly the cloth slipped. Her shoulders ached, her breath uneven, yet she forced herself onward. Each stroke was slower, each pause longer, as though time itself had thickened. David could not bear it. He dropped to his knees beside her, reaching to take the rag, but she shoved it back into his palm, whispering through clenched teeth, "No, don't." Her eyes glistened, desperate not to see him pulled into the same cruelty. For a moment, the two of them froze in silent struggle, her pleading to keep him safe, his heart tearing at the sight of her pain. David's eyes reddened, moisture gathering at the edges as his jaw tightened. Across the room, a sharp sound interrupted Harlan's fingers tapping the table, each strike steady, deliberate, like a clock counting down. His gaze locked on them, cold and expectant, daring David to cross the line. The air thickened, every breath strained. Elena lowered her head again, cloth brushing the ivory keys. David knelt beside her, his hand hovering torn between obedience and defiance. The moment stretched taut, every second heavier than the last, until silence itself threatened to snap. Harlan rose from his seat, walking with unhurried confidence across the polished floor. He stopped by a delicate crystal vase perched on the edge of a console. With a casual flick, he nudged it off balance. Elena gasped, her body jerking forward. She caught it just in time, her hands trembling as the vase wobbled dangerously before settling again. Her chest heaved, heart hammering against her ribs. Harlan's voice was calm, almost amused. "Do you know it's worth more than your entire year's wages?" The words slid like a blade, cutting deeper than any scolding. The staff froze. Not a shuffle, not a whisper, only wide eyes watching the game unfold. Fear kept them silent. Fear kept them complicit. David inhaled sharply, his lungs straining. His hands shook, fists forming so tight his nails bit into his palms. Rage surged hot through his veins, but he swallowed it, barely holding the leash on his fury. The vase sparkled under the lights, fragile yet untouchable, a symbol of how easily lives could be shattered in a single gesture. Elena stood bent over, clutching it, her body a barrier between destruction and survival. And all the while, Harlan's gaze lingered satisfied at the spectacle he alone controlled. Elena's hands fumbled for a cloth, dabbing carefully at the vase, though it needed no cleaning. Her fingers trembled so violently the fabric slipped against the glass, squeaking faintly. Her eyes brimmed with tears, her lips pressed together to hold back a sob. Her reflection wavered in the crystal-red eyes, pale skin, a woman eroded by silence. She bit down on her lip until it hurt, desperate to keep from crying aloud. David's gaze pierced the distance. Every tremor in her hands felt like a blow to his chest. His heart clenched tight and merciless as if a fist closed around it. He wanted to shout, to tear the moment apart, but the weight of her earlier plea kept him still. Then inside his skull another voice rose, his father's, deep and commanding. "There are moments to be quiet and moments to stand. A good man knows the difference." David's throat tightened. He swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling as though he were preparing for battle. His eyes never left Elena, nor the cruel smirk flickering on Harlan's lips. Each second dragged, pulling him closer to the edge. Silence pressed heavy, but beneath it rumbled something dangerous. The breaking point was near, and David felt it in his very bones. Harlan's footsteps were unhurried, each one deliberate as he closed the distance to Elena. He bent low, his face hovering above hers, his words striking like ice faster. "I don't have all day." Elena stiffened, her spine locked as if she had turned to stone. Her breath came in sharp bursts, chest rising and falling too quickly. The rag slipped slightly in her grip, her knuckles white as she clung to it like a lifeline. David moved forward another step closer, his boots grinding against the floor. His body carried the weight of unspoken rage, of patience stretched thin. The room froze. The staff lowered their eyes, yet their ears strained for what would come next. The silence was unnatural, a pause before a storm, every second dragging like a held breath. Harlan tilted his head, the faintest curl at his lip, unaware that in pressing closer to Elena he had also pressed David to the very brink. The moment teetered. One word, one gesture, and the fragile restraint would break. David inhaled deep and steady, as though summoning every ounce of strength left inside him. Then his voice tore through the silence, sharp and clear. "You should apologize to my wife." The words struck the room like a whip. Elena spun around, her eyes wide, horror painted across her face. "David, no." Her voice cracked, lost between fear and disbelief. Around them, pens clattered to the floor, papers rustled. A worker gasped aloud before clamping a hand over her mouth. Even the hum of machines seemed to falter the world itself, pausing to listen. Harlan's brows rose slightly. For a heartbeat, surprise flickered in his expression, then it vanished, replaced by a thin smile. His eyes gleamed sharp and amused, as though he had just discovered an unexpected opponent in a game he thought he controlled. The air quivered with the impact of those words. David stood firm, chest heaving, yet unshaken. The line had been crossed. There was no retreat. Elena rushed forward, her hands clutching David's arm with desperate force. Her voice broke as she cried out, "David, don't, please." The words spilled in sobs, her throat raw with panic. Tears traced hot lines down her cheeks, glistening against the dim light. Her grip trembled but did not loosen, as though she could physically hold him back from disaster. David looked down at her, his eyes softening only for a moment. Behind the weariness and sorrow there was iron, a decision already sealed. He gently pulled her fingers away one by one, freeing himself from her hold. Elena's breath caught a sharp gasp as if she had been struck. She reached again, but he had already stepped past her, his back now, straight, his shoulders squared. David closed the distance with unflinching resolve, planting himself directly before Harlan. His gaze locked onto the man's cold smile, a clash of fire against ice. The staff dared not breathe. Elena, sobbing quietly, could only watch as the man she loved chose dignity over safety, even if it meant risking everything they had left. Harlan's laugh was low, a short bark of disdain. "Apologize. Do you even know who you're speaking to?" His words dripped with mockery, each syllable designed to humiliate. He began to circle David's steps, slow and deliberate like a predator sizing up prey. His shoes echoed across the marble, a rhythm of dominance that pressed on every ear in the room. The workers instinctively backed away, forming an unspoken ring around the confrontation. Shoulders hunched, heads bowed, their fear drew them into silence. Their retreat left David alone in the center, the focus of every gaze, the target of every ounce of Harlan's power. Elena's sobs broke through the heavy stillness. She trembled where she stood, hands clutching at her chest as though to hold her heart in place. Her body shook with each uneven breath, torn between terror for her husband and despair for herself. The air grew stifling, thick with anticipation. Every second stretched thin, fragile as glass. One wrong move, one more word, and the silence would shatter. Harlan's smirk deepened. With a swift motion, he tossed a thick bundle of papers onto the table. The pile scattered pages, fanning across the floor with a crack that cut the silence. "Find the mistake in this," he ordered, arms folding across his chest. David stooped, gathering the sheets. The paper edges sliced lightly against his skin as he stacked them back together. Rows of numbers filled the pages, endless columns, calculations layered upon calculations, a forest of digits meant to overwhelm. He flipped one page, then another. His eyes traced line after line, the ink blurring as pressure bore down. Behind him, Harlan leaned casually against the table, gaze, steady lips curled into a sneer that said he already knew the outcome. The staff watched in rigid silence. For them, the exercise was cruel theater. For David, it was a challenge meant to break him in front of everyone. The sound of pages turning filled the air, each rustle sharp, each pause heavy. Sweat gathered at his temples, sliding slowly down his face. Still, he kept scanning, refusing to bow his head. Around the room, the workers began to trade glances, whispers rising just above the silence. A young woman leaned toward a colleague, her voice thin with dread. "He'll never find it. He'll lose." An older man shook his head, sorrow heavy in his expression. His lips pressed into a line, pity clouding his gaze. They had seen many brought down in similar games, and none had walked away intact. Elena stood frozen, her hands entwined so tightly her knuckles whitened. She prayed without words, every part of her trembling. Each page David turned was another knife against her hope, another test she wished he had never faced. And yet David remained silent, steady. His brow furrowed, his eyes fixed on the figures before him, searching with relentless focus. He shut out the whispers, the pity, the fear. For him, only the numbers mattered now. Numbers that did not lie, numbers that might reveal the truth hidden in plain sight. The tension in the room grew unbearable, everyone waiting for the inevitable failure. But David's stillness carried something different. A quiet certainty, a resolve that seemed to sharpen rather than break under pressure. David's finger halted on the page. His brow furrowed, eyes narrowing as numbers crystallized in his mind. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his gaze. "Page 3, he said, voice steady, and page 6. They don't match." The words dropped into the silence like a thunderclap. All around, heads jerked upward, startled by the certainty in his tone. The rustle of disbelief swept through the room. Harlan's expression flickered, barely a breath, barely a second, but it was enough. Surprise darted across his features before the mask returned. David laid the pages flat on the table, tapping the figures with a calloused hand. "This isn't oversight. This is deliberate. These numbers are false." His voice rose, firm, unshaken. "This is a lie." The declaration shattered the hush. The perfect symmetry of power cracked as one man, a factory worker cast aside, dared to name the truth aloud. For the first time, the invincible aura surrounding Harlan West trembled. A young assistant gasped, unable to stop herself. "I saw that too. Last week. I thought it was my mistake." Her confession broke the dam. Another worker muttered agreement, nodding quickly, then another. Voices rose, small but insistent, like sparks igniting dry wood. Soon, murmurs filled every corner of the room. The once subdued staff leaned toward each other, trading hurried words, pointing discreetly at the papers. Fear had bound their tongues for years, but the truth once spoken aloud grew louder with every repetition. At the center, Harlan's jaw clenched, his hand curled into a fist, veins tightening against his skin. His face darkened fury, barely restrained. For decades his authority had been unquestioned, his rule absolute. And now, before his very eyes, it wavered. The circle of employees no longer looked at him with pure fear. Some eyes carried doubt, others the faint shimmer of defiance. The silence he had crafted for so long was unraveling into a chorus of whispers. And whispers, once begun, cannot easily be silenced. The room quaked under the force of his palm slamming against the table. Papers jumped, pens clattered to the floor. "Enough!" his voice thundered, shattering the growing tide of whispers. His glare locked on David sharp and merciless. "Do you know who you've challenged?" he roared, his tone carrying both fury and pride. He straightened his posture, radiating the weight of power withheld too long. His voice cut through every corner. "I am not some middle manager. I am Harlan West." The words slammed into the crowd. Gasps erupted. Eyes widened. Shock carved itself onto every face. For years his name had lived as a shadow, a rumor, a threat whispered in hallways. Now the shadow stood before them in the flesh. Elena's knees buckled. She clutched her mouth with trembling hands, a sob catching in her throat. Around her, workers staggered back, stunned into silence. The truth revealed at last felt heavier than any lie. The predator had removed his mask and the prey stood in his arena stripped of excuses with nowhere left to run. David drew in a deep breath, his chest rising as if anchoring himself. His eyes locked on Harlan, unwavering, carved with iron resolve. His voice rang clear, each syllable sharp as steel. "I don't care who you are. You humiliated my wife. And the numbers. They do not lie." The words cut across the room, echoing against marble and glass, louder than any title, louder than any fortune. The staff froze, caught between terror and awe. Hearts raced in their chests, pulses hammering as though something forbidden had just been spoken aloud. Elena's eyes filled not with fear this time, but with something fragile and luminous. She looked at her husband as though seeing him anew, not as the man beaten down by layoffs and hardship, but as the man who refused to bow. David's stance did not waver. His hand clenched around Elena's, grounding them both. He was no longer just defending her. He was declaring that dignity could not be bought no matter who stood against him. Harlan's eyes widened, fury blazing, yet no words came. His mouth opened, then closed, silence gripping him like a choke. The room stood utterly still. Not even a breath dared break the stillness. The pounding of hearts became the only rhythm, heavy and insistent, filling the silence with thunder that could not be heard but felt. Then, from the back of the room, a single clap rang out. Weak, tentative, but undeniable. All eyes snapped toward the sound. A lone employee, trembling yet resolute, brought hands together again. Another followed, then another. The sound grew, each clap stronger than the last, until the room quaked with it. Applause cascaded like falling stones, filling every corner, shaking the silence that had ruled for years. For the first time, fear fractured. In its place surged something Harlan had not felt from his staff in decades, defiance made visible, audible, unstoppable. David stood in the center, his presence the spark that had set silence ablaze. Harlan forced his lips into a smile, but it trembled at the edges, betraying the control he fought to keep. He turned his head, scanning the room. Where once eyes had fallen away from his gaze, now they met it, steady, unflinching. The workers lifted their chins, their expressions no longer shrouded in submission. Some stared with open defiance, others with quiet resolve. Their fear had been pierced, and once broken it could not be so easily restored. Harlan's cold mask faltered. Beneath the surface of his stare flickered uncertainty cracks forming in the armor of authority that had once been absolute. In the center, David remained hand-wrapped around Elena's trembling fingers. His body stood tall, shoulders squared, as though his very presence anchored the room. The man who had entered as an outsider now stood as the unshaken pillar against which all eyes steadied themselves. The empire of fear, built over decades, showed its first fracture, and it was widening. Inside Harlan's chest, something unfamiliar stirred alarm. For years, silence had been his shield, obedience his throne. Now the air no longer bent to his command. The murmurs spread like cracks through a wall once thought indestructible. Low voices, cautious but undeniable, rippled across the room. He could not silence them with a glance. He could not erase the truth with a word. A dryness clung to his throat. He swallowed hard, but it did not ease. Sweat pricked along his hairline, sliding slowly down his temples. His suit still gleamed, his tie still perfect, but beneath the polish his composure frayed. The authority he had wielded like a blade wavered. The weight of his name, his fortune, his empire, none of it could cage the shift happening before him. For the first time, the ground beneath him felt unsteady, trembling as loyalty slipped away, grain by grain. The predator had glimpsed his own vulnerability. Through the roar of uncertainty, David heard a familiar echo, his father's voice steady as oak. "There are moments when you must rise, son. A man knows when not to bow." The words surged through him, stronger now than ever. He tightened his grip on Elena's hand. She looked up at him, lips trembling, tears shimmering in her eyes. Her voice cracked barely more than breath. "I trust you." Those 3 words ignited him. The weariness of years, the humiliation of poverty, the fear of loss, all of it burned away. What remained was a fire he could no longer hold back. He lifted his chin, gaze unshaken, and faced Harlan directly. The billionaire loomed with wealth and reputation, but David's eyes did not falter. They carried the weight of something deeper, dignity, inheritance, the promise of a father to a son, now passed to a husband protecting his wife. The contrast was stark. One man trembling beneath fading power, the other steady in the quiet strength of conviction. Harlan's voice dropped low, deliberate, heavy, with reluctant respect. "You did not break, and that is what makes you dangerous." David's reply came without pause, clear and cutting. "No, that makes me free. You can take away a job, take away money, even strip away comfort, but you cannot take a man's dignity." Each word landed sharp, slicing into the pride Harlan had built his empire upon. The marble walls that once echoed only with silence now reverberated with truth, each sentence dismantling the myth of his untouchable power. Around them, heads nodded slowly, courage flickering in eyes long dulled by fear. Murmurs rose again, not of dread this time, but of agreement. Elena's tears flowed freely, but her sobs carried release rather than despair. Her husband's words had given shape to what she had always hoped, that their worth could not be crushed under cruelty. Harlan stood stiff, his smile gone, his chest rising with uneven breaths. Every sentence had been a blow, not with fists, but with something far more dangerous, the undeniable weight of truth. For the first time, Harlan West had no words. His lips pressed tight. The sharp retort he always carried caught somewhere in his throat. His hand twitched at his side, trembling, the knuckles paling with strain. The room held its breath. No one moved, no one dared to speak. Every gaze fixed on him not with fear, but with anticipation, waiting to see if the untouchable giant would shatter further. Harlan turned his head, unable to meet their eyes. The same eyes that once fell at his command now stared back unflinching, exposing the cracks in the armor he had polished for years. The silence stretched heavy, merciless, and in that silence his empire fractured. It was not in the numbers, not in the applause, but in the moment he looked away. Power had slipped from his grasp, and everyone in the room felt it. David did not press further. He knew the battle had already been won, not with victory shouted, but with silence that condemned the tyrant more than words ever could. He reached for Elena, her hand still trembling, and drew her close. With steady strength he guided her toward the exit. Each step was heavy with exhaustion, but firm with certainty. He did not need to look back. The workers parted instinctively, forming a path. Their eyes followed him not with pity, but with awe. In their expressions was gratitude, admiration, the recognition that dignity had been defended in their name as much as Elena's. At the center of it all, Harlan stood motionless, his lips pressed into a thin, bitter line. He watched them leave, knowing the tide had turned against him. His silence was not choice, it was defeat. David's stride carried him forward, every step an affirmation they had survived, they had not bowed. The door opened, and for the first time in years, Elena lifted her face to meet the world outside. The air felt lighter, no longer pressing her down. She inhaled deeply, shoulders easing. A smile, fragile at first, touched her lips. It quivered, uncertain, then grew real, radiant in its simplicity. Tears still streaked her cheeks, but they mingled with joy rather than fear. David's hand tightened around hers. His voice low but steady wrapped around her like a promise. "We did it." She turned to him, her eyes glimmering. The weight that had crushed her chest lifted, replaced by a warmth she thought she had forgotten. Together they stepped into the glow of light pouring through the doorway. The warmth brushed their faces soft and forgiving. It was not the end of their struggles, but in that moment the burden of silence had been broken. For the first time in too long, Elena allowed herself to smile a smile born not of surrender, but of freedom. After David's departure, the halls no longer felt the same. Workers whispered at first, then spoke openly, their voices no longer afraid to be heard. Heads lifted where once they had bowed. Movements grew steadier, more assured, as if chains had quietly fallen away. The shadows of fear loosened, the silence cracked. They knew the empire above them was not invincible, its power not eternal. And all of it began with one ordinary husband who refused to bend a single act of courage, sparking a fire no command could extinguish. Alone in his private room, Harlan sat in silence. A glass of wine rested untouched in his hand, its surface still. His eyes darkened heavy with thoughts he could not escape. "He did not break," he murmured almost to himself. "I have never met one like him." The words hung in the air, sharp with reluctant respect. He drew a slow breath, shoulders sinking, and gave the faintest nod. It was not apology, not surrender. But in that quiet acknowledgment, the predator admitted what he had long denied. His power had limits, and one man had shown him so. Hand in hand, David and Elena walked the narrow road home. No towers of glass, no empire of wealth. Only each other and the dignity they had defended. Their steps were quiet, yet every stride carried freedom. When power feeds on fear, it will crumble before the dignity of an ordinary soul. And will you stay silent for safety, or rise to earn respect?